Juice. Juice is an undefinable quality in video games which describes the intangible, tactile sensation experienced when interacting with them. Whether this means pausing the animation for a few frames when landing a hit in a fighting game to really emphasize the weight behind each strike, or giving your platforming character a feeling of weight and momentum, YouTuber Mark Brown sums it up quite well when he says that Juice is all about doubling down on what your game is most about. At this point, there are many established techniques to make a game juicy. The most common ones being screen shake, particles, bassy, loud sound effects, and a satisfying control scheme. The genre which I find to be a bit more elusive in their definition of juice are strategy games. There are many subgenres of strategy games, with the most well-known examples being StarCraft, Age of Empires, Civilization, Anno, and Bloons Tower Defense. What does and doesn't fit the definition of a strategy game is a bit undefined, since most games require some sort of a strategy to play. But the definition that I will be using is that strategy games are games where the player controls a multitude of entities instead of a single character. This definition isn't perfect, but it's accurate enough, and it will lead into a point which I will make later. These types of games are often slower and more cerebral than platformers or action games, which is why they will naturally find it difficult to rely solely on particle effects and screen shake to wow their players. They are, nonetheless, still incredibly satisfying to play, and over the course of this essay we will explore the many different facets about what strategy games are all about and how we can double down on them. Number 1. Synergy. Since strategy games are all about controlling a group of entities, whether they be people, buildings, ships, or resources, tying all these entities together as much as possible can either present the player with a multitude of options to choose from or limit them, guiding him towards interesting decisions. In the dystopian auto-battler Despot's game, you can equip your little pink humans with items to give them a single class. Once you have enough humans of the same class in your army, this trait will activate, giving all members of that class a collective bonus. Unfortunately, these classes barely interact with each other. The result is that beyond the basic holy trinity of healers, tanks, and damage dealers, there are few interesting synergies to optimize your team comp, and your runs end up being quite similar. Riot Games' Teamfight Tactics is also an auto-battler, but here your units have not one, but two traits, and since only one unit of the same type can contribute to your trait pool, players have to create this interesting web of synergy where overlapping units can bring in far more than just the sum of their parts, and you feel like Hannibal Barca himself when you manage to pull off a full transition in the middle of a game. When trying to find inspiration for new types of synergies, I like looking towards virtual card games like Legends of Runeterra or Slay the Spire. Since the core aspect of these games is to build a deck with overpowered combos, they seem to have the least inhibition when searching for new things that can synergize with each other. From basic stat boosting to how many cards there are in your deck, how many cards you have sacrificed, or how little mana you have. These may sound like extremely basic concepts for a card game, but they would be next to revolutionary if they were implemented into a different strategy game subgenre. Let's look at an example. In Legends of Runeterra, the champion Jinx levels up if you have no more cards in your hand. Her supporting cards are therefore either very cheap, so that you can play them very quickly, or they can be used to throw away other parts of your hand. Imagine applying this sort of a principle into an Empire type in a 4X game that would, instead of constantly hoarding resources like Smog the Dragon, benefit from having the least amount of currency possible stockpiled at the same time. It would turn the entire concept of an efficiently run, resource-maximizing civilization on its head, and allow players to look at every other available decision from a different angle, resulting in more interesting choices. Part 2, Presentation. 2.1, Planning. A core part of any strategy game is, well, the strategy. Setting up a complex trade network in slipways, or watching your empire grow from a small primitive planet to an interstellar empire in Stellaris is a core experience for most 4X and management games. Unfortunately, humans aren't computers, which means that even if we want to make a complex long-term plan, it can become difficult to keep the details in our head. In the real world, people write down notes or download special organization apps to keep track of a complex plan. If you're not getting paid for it, however, I doubt anybody's going to start up an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of when and how you're going to set up your economy in 10 hours' time. Instead, it pays off to integrate some optional UI elements that simplify long-term planning. In Civilization 6, a large factor in optimizing your civilization comes from adjacency bonuses, where you place a district or building onto a tile and adjacent tiles receive a certain bonus. To keep track of all of this, the game allows you to put down markers on the map, letting you plan out your district and city placement far into the future. The mini 4X game Slipways, which is all about connecting planets with trade routes to increase their prosperity, takes this concept one step further. In it, you must settle planets with certain types of colonies which consume and produce different resources, and then connect these settlements with slipway trade routes. The more trade routes a planet is connected to, the more prosperous it becomes, but you cannot change a colony's type once you've settled it. You cannot remove trade routes which have already been placed, and slipways cannot cross each other. Planning ahead is therefore a vital part of any campaign. The ability to label planets with intended colonies before settling them is one of the first things the tutorial teaches you. Without this option, it would quickly become impossible to plot too far into the future, and the resulting mess of missed opportunities would be anything but satisfying. This planning feature, however, is much more than just a crutch to keep a complex game organized. Once you are done drafting your plan in slipways, you settle the planets by simply clicking on the markers, paying off your exhaustive preparations with a cathartic boost to your empire size. Couple this with some satisfying sound effects, and you have a very simple concept that can keep players occupied for days on end. 2.2 Immersion. A game that seems to break many rules of juice is Stellaris. Stellaris is a 4X game about building up an interstellar empire. You will explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations, and boldly go where no one has gone before. On the surface, Stellaris seems pretty bare bones mechanically. There are no adjacency bonuses. In fact, there are barely any interesting synergies at all. If you want a lot of science, then you spam research facilities and consumer goods and go after science bonuses. If you want to focus on expansion, then you build a lot of alloy foundries because alloys are the only resource required to build military ships. Aside from building different buildings, your economy ends up working the same in both cases. Combat is also quite simple. You mostly just right-click the enemy fleet, and if you had the bigger numbers with the better modifiers, then your ships win. Due to this relative simplicity, there is little point in an elaborate planning system. There is an expansion planner submenu, which is about as useful as an inflatable dartboard, and while you do have to plan far into the future, this mostly just comes down to finding ways to spam out as much research and population growth as possible, with few interconnected synergies. Why then are so many people, me included, able to play campaign after campaign only to end up getting wiped out by the endgame crisis anyways? Because economic management or outsmarting your opponents on the battlefield isn't the focus of Stellaris. In its core, Stellaris is about role-playing. The juice elements, which double down on the game's primary aspects, are tuned to enhance the player's ability to immerse themselves into this world which they are creating. Every technology, every ship, planet, structure, and building has a small lore blurb attached to it, explaining its context well enough to imply what it looks like, but they're not detailed enough to stop a player's imagination from filling out the blanks. While exploring surrounding systems in the early game, you will encounter many small events, like anomalies and the larger archaeological sites. Mechanically, they are similar to the villages encountered in the Civilization games. You move your scout onto them and gain a small random reward. In Stellaris, however, every anomaly has a relatively long text attached to it, fleshing out the story behind each encounter. It may have the mechanical depth of Cookie Clicker, but just like that game, the built-in story provides most of the fun. The characters in Stellaris are not necessarily individual leaders, but much rather the other empires in the galaxy. And building relationships with these neighboring empires is a key aspect of the game. There are several mechanics in place to make sure that each one of your neighbors doesn't only get his own personality, but also that he sticks around long enough for you to build a relationship with them. In order to prevent the constant 4x temptation to simply attack your neighbors at every opportunity and take their territory and resources, you will first need to claim an opponent's star systems using influence. Since influence is a rare resource, you will usually tend to only claim systems which are actually valuable, meaning even after a victorious war, you will still have that same empire somewhat intact near your borders, allowing long-term relationships and potential political consequences to happen. Since Stellaris lets you build customizable factions which can then randomly appear in a game, this allows you to pull experiences from past games or even other franchises to fill your own headcanon and predetermine the type of story that will be told in your campaigns. Couple that with awe-inspiring splash arts and an excellent soundtrack, and you will allow a player's fantasy to do most of the work for you. .3 Music and Audio. I really loved playing XCOM 2 out of many different reasons. Therefore, when I heard that several developers who had worked on XCOM 2 had made a spin-off game called Pheonix Point, with similar mechanics and even a similar story, I got excited. Unfortunately, I barely made it past the 5-hour mark before feeling underwhelmed and bored. The mechanical similarities between XCOM and Pheonix Point were obvious. They had even made several improvements, trimming down the RNG factor, which I really liked, but I just didn't enjoy it. Reading through the Steam reviews, there are a couple of reasons for this, most likely stemming from the fact that Pheonix Point had a much lower budget than XCOM 2, but I would like to highlight both games' overall presentation. This is what gearing up for a mission in Pheonix Point is like. It's okay, you're just going out there for another one of dozens of missions fighting aliens, nothing special. Here's what it's like in XCOM 2.
We're calling this heavy power armor the War Suit. This is as tough and strong as we can make it, with plenty of power for handling heavy weapons.
5x5.
Picking up an intermittent distress signal, and as far as we can tell, the aliens are hitting back against one of the resistance outposts. It doesn't look good. We're moving in to secure the area as quickly as possible. Neutralize all enemy contacts. Menace 1-5, hostile forces are attacking the outpost. Eliminate all enemy units and protect those civilians.
I haven't touched XCOM 2 in several years, but I still remember every single note of that theme. XCOM 2 and Pheonix Point are all about going on these missions to fight aliens. 90% of the exciting stuff happens there. Setting off on one of these missions shouldn't feel like going out doing chores where you're grinding for resources, but much rather like setting out on an epic quest to defeat the invaders who have taken away your home and are killing your friends. I must have gone off on 1,000 missions in XCOM 2, and that fanfare ensured that I would never get bored when gearing up, even though I almost always took the exact same loadouts and squad compositions every single mission. Let's compare these games side by side and try to pick out the differences. In XCOM 2, the camera frames your entire squad of soldiers and is pivoted slightly upward, which is a common cinematic trick to make something look larger and more impressive as opposed to filming downward. In Pheonix Point, not only is each soldier shown individually, but they are also really small on the player's screen. XCOM 2 also enhances the importance of your weapons by having the soldiers pose and play around with them a little bit when you select them, as opposed to merely standing still. Once you have selected your squad, the game will need to render the map, which means there is an inevitable loading screen. This can be a problem, since regular loading screens will break any tension or investment that may have been built up in advance of a mission. I've noticed about myself that I always instinctively take out my phone whenever a loading screen pops up in any game. XCOM cleverly disguises this by hiding the first half of the loading screen behind the animation of the Sky Ranger taking off, and then by this short shot of your soldiers waiting inside while a character briefs you on the current mission. The soundtrack also never stops between any of these scenes and only fades out as the mission is starting and your soldiers are deploying. This technique makes the individual scenes flow into each other and helps preserve any emotions that have been built up beforehand. Pheonix Point also has an animation of a landing dropship, probably as an homage to XCOM, but not only is it framed without any dynamic camera movements, but it also plays after the loading screen is finished, turning it into just another annoying cutscene. The difference is also noticeable during missions. In terms of soundtrack, XCOM 2 has this constant, tense, fast-paced beat in the background while your team is still disguised, abruptly interrupted by an explosion of action music as they are discovered.
Impressed yet? They found us!
Once all opponents are dead, the action music fades back into silence as you breathe a sigh of relief that you've managed to survive another fight.
Target destroyed.
Dynamic soundtracks, which adapt to the player's current situation, are generally an excellent way to maintain a sense of pacing for any genre. Pheonix Point, on the other hand, just seems to have a subdued, disconnected synth-ish music which doesn't adapt to the current situation at all. These awkward pauses, where the camera films into nothingness, happen in XCOM as well. They seem to be an integral problem with both games' dynamic camera and the way the AI works. It's just that in XCOM 2, this appears far less jarring because it usually happens when an enemy squad has discovered you, And due to the tense soundtrack, you much rather get the impression that the jerky camera represents your panicked and surprised soldiers quickly trying to assess the new threat. But not just the soundtrack was significantly better in XCOM 2, but the handling of the weapons is different as well. This is what firing a heavy weapon is like in Pheonix Point. And this is what it's like in XCOM. If every single shot in both XCOM and Pheonix Point can mean the difference between life and death of one of your squad mates, then designers should let the players know that with every tool they have at their disposal. There is no shortage of satisfying, bassy sound effects for guns and lasers on the internet to be inspired by. With enough creativity, even something superficially harmless like a ray of light or a prayer can appear impactful. Just please don't make your super powerful plasma cannon sound like a champagne cork. Camera framing is also important. When firing a weapon in XCOM 2, the camera pans out to show both the target and the shooter, and the trajectory of the projectile along with any collateral damage to the environment. It allows the player to see what's happening and appreciate any juice behind fancy animations or big explosions. This is where it's a bit difficult to directly criticize Pheonix Point because the cramped camera angles are a result of the game's targeting system. While XCOM 2 just calculates a percentage on whether a shot will hit or not based on cover, aiming skill, and defense skill, resulting in some questionable situations, Pheonix Point has an actual crosshair depicting the spread of your weapon and even the different body parts that you can hit to apply certain effects. Gameplay-wise, this is certainly an improvement over XCOM's aiming system, but unfortunately, the constrained camera angle, along with the weapon's subpar sound design, and really awkward reaction noises of the person getting hit, just makes everything feel lackluster. XCOM 2 also has many small additional quality advantages. Many individual XCOM soldiers with different nationalities actually have voice lines in their respective language and regional dialect, which helps emphasize the fact that you are uniting all of humanity under this common banner. Pheonix Point just takes the Hollywood approach by giving non-English characters a foreign accent and a colorful personality.
I can make a difference.
Although XCOM 2 does this to a lesser extent as well.
I can get there.
The fact that, on top of this, the XCOM 2 team hired John Delancey and half the Star Trek TNG cast to do voice lines for several characters is probably an indicator that much of this improved quality is a result of having a much higher budget. It is very much possible that the makers of Pheonix Point are aware of their juice issues, but had perhaps overreached and then lacked the resources for that extra polishing, or they were generally planning to make the game less of a tense race against the clock and preferred more of a slow, strategic approach. Regardless, the result, at least for me, was clear. When I started recording footage of both games for this video, XCOM 2 immediately pulled me in, and I actually finished that campaign in my free time, while every single mission in Pheonix Point just kind of felt like a chore. Part 3. A steady amount of stimulation. For average players, a single campaign in a grand strategy game like Civilization or Stellaris will usually last between 15 and 30 hours. Keeping the player's attention for such an amount of time can be a difficult task, especially if you can't guarantee that something interesting like a war or an important dispute will happen all the time. To keep players engaged, designers need to constantly have them making small but impactful decisions. Usually, this will mean setting up multiple mini-tasks which will run parallel to each other. In Civilization, all of your cities are constantly producing either buildings or units, and most players will only queue up one thing at a time in order to stay flexible. Every time a city finishes its current production, a prompt will show up above the End Turn button, and clicking on it will immediately open said city's production menu. These End Turn prompts are available for most important actions in the game, streamlining the gameplay and allowing players to basically never have to navigate through any complicated menus and keep track of everything manually, since whenever you are wondering whether you're forgetting something, you can just look at the bottom right corner of the screen. Turn-based games generally seem to have an easier time setting up this flow state where players always have just the right amount of stuff to do, since the game is practically permanently paused and you can always take as much time as you want. RTS games like Stellaris, on the other hand, can become a bit overwhelming here. Since there is no end turn button, I usually find myself rotating through several different menus searching for notifications. The fact that important notifications appear at different locations on screen adds to the confusion. Having a single menu, like a situation room or something, where all these notifications are displayed at once would perhaps mimic the effect of the end turn button. Especially towards the late game, where you tend to spend more and more time paused rummaging through menus, since you logically have more stuff, like planets, fleets, and even gameplay mechanics. I sometimes tend to lose heart when my carefully balanced economy starts getting torn apart by the endgame crisis, a massive force of extragalactic invaders which are supposed to provide the ultimate boss fight for your campaign. The idea behind the endgame crisis is to test your overpowered late-game empire and pit it against an even more powerful force, resulting in an epic struggle to the death where everything is balanced on a knife's edge, no matter how powerful you may have become. Unfortunately, this epic struggle can become a bit tedious when you are forced to continue rotating through the same building menus to keep your population occupied, while you feel like you should be worrying about something much more important. One interesting idea to solve this could maybe be found in the upcoming Distant Stars 2, where you can allegedly automate every single aspect of your empire, even going so far as to fully automate expansion and diplomacy, essentially handing your empire over to the AI whenever you want. This would potentially allow players to micromanage only the interesting parts and skip the bloated late-game 4X administration. Many grand strategy games have some sort of automatic management system, but it's often buggy and inefficient, and therefore seldom utilized. Stellaris has taken an interesting step to combat fiddly micromanagement by implementing mechanics like transit hubs, buildings which automatically resettle excess population to other planets on your empire at a reduced cost, thereby automating this process for the player. Conclusion: the most important rule of JUICE, of that intangible tactile sensation experienced when interacting with strategy games, is to reinforce the feeling that the game is trying to convey. Is your game about organization? Then have the interactions between different entities constantly affect whatever is happening on screen, and give the player as many tools as possible to plan far ahead. Is the game more about diplomacy and role-playing? Then focus more on the game's ambience, on firing up your player's imagination by only implying the game's depth instead of spelling it out for them, without adding too many distracting or gamey planning elements. Regardless of genre, always remember to properly present your game. A well-made soundtrack, splash arts, or at least some description text can do wonders for your player's imagination. Finally, do your best to give your players every chance to maintain an overview, because no matter how many feats of ingenuity or inspiring stories are taking place, if nobody can see that they happened, then they might as well not have happened at all.